Good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Gugliata. I'm the Senior Manager of Public and Government Affairs. And this morning, I am joined by Shane Snowdon. I want to thank you all for joining us. Should you have any questions for Shane throughout our discussion, I strongly encourage you just to go and type those into the chat, and we will be hearing those questions. We'll pitch those questions to Shane toward the end of our webinar session. And I just want y'all to have a little bit of background here. I had reached out to Shane after reading a blog that she wrote about her experience of being the driver in a fatal crash that killed an 18-year-old. And obviously that's an extremely difficult experience. But I'd love to share a portion of her blog entry with you all before she talks to us about her experience. And she wrote, "If you remember nothing else I write, I hope you'll remember this. You do not want to be me. No destination, no text, no drink, no glance away from the road is worth knowing that you've killed another human being. You don't want to feel like you'd give anything not to have been on that road at that time. You don't want to believe that anything you accomplish in this life is offset by the death of another person. You don't want any happiness you experience to remind you of the happiness denied the person you hit, her family, his friends. You don't want to struggle to go on living, convinced you don't deserve to exist, wishing you hadn't been born." In reading that, you feel the weight of the toll that this crash took on you, Shane. So let's start here. Shane, if you could just share with us what happened on that night.
Well, thank you, Diana, for asking and for the invitation to talk today with you. I actually, the night of my crash, and it was early evening, I had just had a really great holiday weekend. I'd been up in San Francisco right before Christmas, actually, and just had a wonderful time. I was feeling light and happy, and I was driving home alone, just feeling really good. And it was about a 90-minute drive home. As I say, early in the evening, the weather was fine. I mean, it was December, but the weather was fine. And I had taken that road dozens, maybe hundreds of times. It's a highway that doesn't really look like a highway. It has a highway speed limit, but it's pretty lightly used, and it's usually one lane in each direction. So I was happy, I was relaxed, I wasn't drunk or high or sleepy. I wasn't doing something like, reaching into the back seat for something, or, eating a sandwich from the, the passenger seat. I was just driving along as my regular self. And I went around a curve, and I had just gone a little ways when I heard and I felt a thud like no thud I had ever heard or felt before. And I saw coming over my hood toward me on his side, I saw a young man in a baseball cap, and he looked at me. We looked at each other. He rolled toward me, and then he hit my windshield and flew over my car. And I just screeched over to the side of the road. And I jumped out of my car, and I thought, I saw him. We looked at each other. Maybe I can find him. Maybe he's okay. Because I did not know yet about cars and what they do. So I ran back up the road, and there were no street lights, but there was a moon. I ran back up the road, and I looked everywhere I could, and I yelled out into the night, "Are you there? Are you there? Are you okay? Are you there? Are you there?" And then I didn't hear anything, so I just stood still so I could hear anything or see him, and nothing. There was no sound, and I could not see him anywhere. And I thought, oh no. So I ran back to my car, and I picked up my phone, and I knew there was really, really terrible cell phone coverage there, but I thought, 911, 911, 911. I just kept calling and calling, and the call kept dropping. And finally, I got an operator, and I said, I said, I think I know I've hit somebody. I think he's really, really hurt. I think he might be dead. Can you get someone here? She said, where are you? And I told her, and she said, I don't think we can get anyone there for like half an hour. And I said, please, please, I think he's really, really hurt. And the call dropped. So I thought half an hour. I ran back up the road, and I started looking and stopping and listening. Nothing. And finally, a car came by, and it was I waved at the guy driving it, and he leaned out. I went over to his window, and I said, I think I've just hit somebody. I think I might have killed him. And he obviously thought I was crazy. I think he just thought this woman is nuts, and he just drove around me. And I thought, oh, sorry. I started looking and looking all over again, and then another car came along, and I waved it down, and there were two young women in the car, and they pulled over. And I told them, and they grabbed a flashlight, and they stepped out of the car, and I said, I think he's somewhere over there. I'll walk up here. You walk over there. And they walked out with their flashlight, and they said, we found him. And I ran over to where they were, and they pointed the flashlight, and I saw him. I saw him. And they turned and went back to their car with the flashlight. I saw him, and I wanted to go over to him. I wanted to go over to him. He wasn't moving. He wasn't moving at all. I wanted to go over to him. And I thought, am I allowed to go over to him? I'm the person who hit him. And I thought, I have to go over to him. I went over him, and I stood there, and I could tell he was gone. And I just stood there and sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And I don't know how much time passed, but it finally occurred to me. I didn't want to leave him. I didn't want to leave him. But it finally occurred to me, Shane, I think that the operator told you to get back in your car and wait for a call and be there when people come. So I turned away, which was so hard. And I started walking back to my car. I walked past the car with the young women, and I turned to thank them, and they put their door locks down. And I thought, oh, right. I'm a killer. I've just killed someone. Right. I walked to my car, got back in, and I can't even tell you the thoughts through the sobs as I waited for the police. And when they finally came, there were a lot of them, and they just, I pointed to where he was. They rolled out life-saving equipment, floodlights, paint, measuring tape, and one of them came over to me and questioned me and tested me and looked at my car. And then he left, and everybody was very understandably out there trying to summon the coroner, as I learned later, and trying to take all the measurements and do all the assessment involved in something like this. And I waited for about 3 hours just saying over and over, I've killed somebody, I've actually killed somebody. The lights, the tape, the paint, the coroner's van arrived. He had died instantly. And finally, after several hours, one of the police officers came over to me, and he said, you should leave now. I thought, just leave like that? And my car was inoperable. So I called my landlord, who had lived in the area for a long time. And I said, I am going to have to ask if you can pick me up. I have hit somebody down the road. And he said, how could anyone hit someone on that road? How could that be? And I just started to cry all over again. I said, I don't know. And he said, I'll have my wife pick you up. And she came, she drove up close to me, and I got out and I looked at her, and I thought, can I get in the car with her? What does she think of me? And she got out, and she held out her arms to me, and she hugged me. And I said, I'm so sorry, I've killed someone. And she said, I know. And she just helped me into the car and took me home. She just took me home. And obviously I didn't sleep that night for a lot of nights afterward. So I'll stop there and just tell you that I eventually, through my insurance company and the police, I found out that the young man I had seen in my windshield, he was just 18. His name was Guillermo, and he had been riding across the highway perpendicular to me on an old borrowed bike to meet his buddies down the road. And technically, I was found not at fault in the crash, but I will never know why, as I came around that curve, I didn't see him. I didn't see him, and he didn't see me. We did not see each other. I'll never know.
It sounds surreal, even just hearing the experience. I'm sure it took a very, very long time to fully, take it all in, process what had happened. And I think it is important that you pointed out, there was no alcohol, no drugs, no distraction. You weren't speeding. Sounds like a lot of this was a visibility issue. But, knowing that you weren't found at fault, Shane, do you still think that you could have done something to prevent the crash?
I think about this all the time now, years later. I've asked myself this a million times. I don't know for sure. I don't want to pretend to myself, much less anyone else, that I know. I don't think I ever will know. I haven't been able to identify something in particular. When they took all the measurements, there wasn't something in particular, but there might have been something that I don't remember, that I just can't fish up. So all I have been able to do about this, Diana, since the crash, I'll tell you, since I don't know and I may never know, I just try to be the best driver I can be. And I'll tell you what's behind that. I think that if something ever happens again, if I'm in another crash, if I've just tried to be the best I can be, at least then I will know that I did my best to be safe and to take good care. And so I do everything I can to be safe, because as hard as it is to live not knowing if I did something to cause that crash, to kill Guillermo, it would be even harder knowing that I did do something. So not knowing, not remembering, I just do what I can. So I don't feel, if there's a next time, that I didn't do my best.
In hearing your story, I mean, as traffic safety advocates, especially at AAA, any person who's really invested in this work of roadway safety, we hate the word accident, because we know that almost in every circumstance, something could have been done by one road user or another, or in terms of infrastructure to prevent it. But I'm struggling with that word crash in your circumstance, hearing your testimony here, because it sounds a lot like accident.
I say crash very, very deliberately. I'm really, really grateful to all the safety advocates, including AAA, have said, let's say crash, not accident. And I'll tell you, from my particular perspective, I mean, there are many reasons to say crash, not accident, but I'll tell you, for me, given my experience, the most important one is to bring home to people crash, the word crash. This is metal hitting flesh or other metal that has flesh right behind it. And I believe that we do need to really take in, every time we get behind the wheel, metal, crash, not an abstract word like accident.
Absolutely, right. And of course, you never want to re-victimize a victim and say, oh, were there lights on the bike? Were there reflectors? Was he visible? And I know you're, of course, past that point, but it has a role to play in what happened in the crash, of course. Shane, if you could just describe, after the crash, after you were able to process what had happened and some time went by, what was life like for you?
A lot of people ask me that, Diana. And my story, it's just my story. everyone's different. I can't speak for other drivers who've brought death. I mean, there are tens of thousands of us out there. There are a lot of us, and we all have different journeys, even though I'm one of a very, obviously a very few talking about it. And I guess I should add that as far as I know, I might be self-deceived. As far as I know, I don't think I'm trying to get sympathy or pity, because actually it seems right to me that I was in a lot of pain afterward. I mean, I had just killed somebody, so that's pain. That is rightful pain. When you kill someone in everyday life, it's obviously a really, really painful shock. I mean, no one ever thinks they're going to bring death to somebody just driving home one night. So I would say one really important thing about my life after the crash is that people were really, really kind. My family, the folks at work, my friends, they really, really tried to be supportive. Even though this is an experience that people don't talk much about, I really tried to be supportive. But to be honest with you, I would have to say that really nothing they said actually reached me. For quite a while, I was just in my own world of pain. You read what I wrote, and it's true. I absolutely wasn't sure if I could or should go on living. I was 41 and he was 18. He had his whole life ahead of him. Why hadn't I died? And actually, I had always been kind of a save the world person, and I had to take in the fact that I had actually killed somebody. So I sleepwalked through every day. I had been a pretty big talker. Maybe you can tell, kind of a talker gal. I didn't talk. I definitely didn't smile or laugh. I may not feel like smiling or laughing, but if I ever had felt that way, I would have felt it was disrespectful. I stared into space a lot, as I had in the car that night, all the time, even at work. I mean, my boss was very, very nice, but I didn't sleep much. And also, I'll mention this, I hope it's not too personal. I actually began to bleed very heavily. That was, part of my reaction. But after a few months of barely living, barely wanting to live, my family finally said to me, I had a family and I had a job, and they said, Shane, you've got to get some help. But there were not any groups for drivers. There were no books. Now there's one group. Now there's one book. So I had to look at counseling. But when you look up therapists, they don't say, oh well, I'm a specialist in people who've killed somebody in everyday life. So I just had to go by instinct, and I ended up picking out a guy actually who did career counseling. But I really, really liked his energy. I just really liked his energy, and he was wonderful. He just sat with me, and I cried and I cried and he cried. He just sat with me until I was ready to talk. And there was a turning point with him. He asked me one day, Shane, do you really have compassion? And I thought, oh, I mean, I think I have compassion for Guillermo, but yes, I will try harder. I will try more. And he said, no, Shane, yes, compassion for Guillermo. Yes, of course. Do you have any compassion for yourself? And I thought, no, that's not a question. But I took it in. It wasn't easy, but I tried to actually think about his question. And over time, I actually was able to start being more present and talking more, my sign of, being present. Very gradually, I began to feel able to go on living. I was able to start feeling that I deserved to go on living, even though my life obviously will never be the same. So in going on, there are a few things that have been really helpful that are right for me, although, everyone is different. And one is, over time, I don't ever try to forget the crash. Whenever I see a crash or I read about a crash, which is all the time. I mean, it is all the time. Once you're sensitized, it's all the time. I stop and I remember Guillermo, and I say a blessing, very much a blessing out loud if I can, for everybody involved. And I mean everybody, the people who have died, their loved ones, the drivers, the passengers, the witnesses, the first responders. the counselors who are going to come on later, everybody. And then when people happen to mention they've been in a crash, and I think it's so important for people to start talking more and more about this experience. When people take the step and mention they've been in a crash in whatever role, I really do try to stop and listen, to what they have to say, because there are so many stories and there's so many crashes, but people very, very seldom talk about them, even though they often really, really want to, not just the drivers, but everyone affected. So I do try to tune in whenever people do want to tell their stories. There is I don't need to tell you all, but there's so much pain around crashes. And this is how I think about it. It is hidden in plain sight. So I think we need to start talking more. Crashes were considered an epidemic, a public health epidemic before COVID. Crashes were the great epidemic, the leading non-medical cause of death in our country, the leading cause of death for people between 5 and 44. Everyone knows someone, almost everyone knows more than one person who's been affected by a fatal crash. So with all of that, I never, never avoid thinking about Guillermo and his family. He is always with me. He is right in my heart with his family. That is where he stays. And the other thing out of this that I did start doing just a few years ago after this journey is I did start talking publicly about hitting and killing somebody.
I was just going to ask you that, Shane, what led to you to make that decision? Obviously a whole lot of courage, but was it also partially that there weren't a lot of resources available to you while you were grieving and trying to heal, that you wanted to put a voice to this?
Part of it was to try to speak, to break the silence, to speak of that pain that's universal but so often hidden. So there was that, just sharing the story for other drivers and other people involved in crashes. But I have to say, I think my first thought was it's like this really simple thought, Diana. How can I honor Guillermo? How can I remember him and honor him? This 18-year-old who did not get a chance to live. What can I do as me? And then I realized not only when drivers don't speak out, we miss an opportunity to connect with one another, but I would say at least as important, we miss the opportunity to speak out to the larger world from our particular perspective. And, as you well know, loved ones of those who have died, they speak out. As hard as it is, those parents, the parents and the children and the spouses and so many loved ones, they speak out about what happened, and their stories are really, really powerful. They get people thinking, they get drivers thinking, oh no, I would never want to hurt someone that way. So the loved one stories, they have been right out there. I mean, we think about MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but there are a lot of loved ones telling their stories, and they do a lot of good. So my feeling, Diana, was, yes, to support other drivers, but I felt maybe I should, other drivers who killed, but I felt even more, how about if I add my voice as a driver who has killed to the voices of the loved ones, if they're okay with that? Because what my thought is, okay, what if people thought about car crashes not only around how it feels to have a loved one die, to have a loved one killed? I thought, that's really, really important. But what if we talked about another piece of that, how it feels to kill somebody as the driver? That's something that I realized a lot of people have not had a chance to think about. They haven't heard from drivers who've killed. And that's why I try to tell my story, and I try to speak out for road safety whenever I see a chance. Like when I read an article about, oh, what a drag lower speed limits are, what a drag, or what a pain that new car safety technology is. I mean, there was an article in the Boston Globe last year. I mean, I'll just name it because I really felt it. I feel a lot of articles like this, but there was an article in the Globe, an example that just quoted people saying, oh, I am so irritated by the beep of my car backup camera. Beep, beep, beep. What a drag, what a pain, what a nuisance and an annoyance to have to hear that, or to discover that I can't turn it off, or it's hard to turn off. So very typical letter from me. I wrote the Globe and I said, hello, Hello? Yes, it's a beep. Yes, it's a pain to hear that beep, but let me describe a greater pain to you. That beep is your guardian angel. Let me tell you, whatever pain you feel hearing that beep that is keeping you from hitting a small child, an elder, or anybody in back of you, a cyclist passing, anybody, the pain and irritation and annoyance you may be feeling about that beep is nothing compared to the pain of backing up and hearing your car and feeling your car have that thud. So I write in whenever I can, and I
Absolutely.
speak to groups about my experience whenever they ask, because I really want to offer people this different and additional view of why to drive carefully. And then, Diana, just in real life, when I'm with people at dinner, and I don't want to be like a death at dinner or, Debbie Downer, but, when
Mhm.
people ask what I do and it feels right, I say, well, some of what I do is I talk about being the driver in a fatal crash. And, I don't like bringing it up, but it actually seems to be okay with people. First, they're often very kind and they really listen. And then something happens. People start talking about their stories, the loved ones they've lost, and the conversation shifts. And I don't know, I just sit there and I think, yeah, we need to be having this conversation a lot more.
You deserve so much respect for what you do. And it's interesting when you mentioned the backup beep, just so everyone of our viewers understands, that technology came out of a campaign. We called it Spot the Tot, but there were so many backover fatalities. And mainly it was parents running over their own children because visibility, as SUVs got more popular in the US. And so I've, had the experience of working with a lot of parent advocates or parents that unfortunately forgot their child in a vehicle and they passed away because of heat stroke, all those different tragedies that can occur. So, shame
Diana, I
God's
don't know
work, absolutely.
you're in the same boat, but I hear people jokingly, and the Globe article was kind of joking, boy, this is a pain, boy, this is drag. And I try. I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but I can't just sit silent and have people complain about life-saving technology. I just try to say as lightly and gently as I can, let me just share something with you. Don't want to be Debbie Downer, but maybe on some level, I do. I do.
Yeah, no,
People,
of course.
people need to know.
Shane, how have people reacted to you going public with your story?
As you can imagine, people have many, many, many different reactions. And I just say, I understand all of them. I understand all. We're talking about death here. We're talking about the death of so many people. And I will say a lot of people, even if they don't feel good about me, I mean, I'm someone who brought death. I understand they don't feel good about me. Nonetheless, a lot of people do tell me, however they feel about me as an individual, that they do remember my story. They even say, I remember the name Guillermo. They say, I remember your story. I remembered your story the next time I got into my car. And I told my kids, and they remind me of it the next time we're all in the car. And they tell me they drive differently because they remember the story. They remember the name. Their kids remind them if they forget. And I just have to say, I so hope that's true. I mean, I don't know for how long they might drive differently, but I am so grateful for that response. And you mentioned, and a few people do say I'm brave, but I have to be honest and say I do not feel brave. I don't feel brave. It really, feels to me like I'm putting one foot in front of the other, just doing what I have to do. Remember Guillermo, and I do think, and maybe this is too much, but I do think I would like to try to save even one life, just one life. And that is what I hope for, and that is what I think about. No matter what people's reactions, I think if you think about this, the next time you get in your car, if even one life or one serious injury is prevented, that's what I hope for. And the rest of people's reactions, of course, don't matter.
I can also say that a lot of the advocates that I've worked with that have lost loved ones in crashes, I think knowing the mind and the hearts of the other driver that caused that crash is sort of the missing piece in their healing process. And I think it takes great courage to do what you're doing, but I hope that hearing your message can help heal a lot of their pain as well.
That's very sweet of you to bring up, and really sensitive. As I say, I get a lot of different reactions. I would say there is no reaction that has ever meant more to me than when a loved one of someone who's died says to me, for example, Shane, we were never in touch with our driver. We never knew. Did they think about the person who died? Did it affect them? Do they remember? And so there are people who have said, loved ones who have said, it is helpful. And I so hope this is the case, that it is helpful to hear from at least one driver, oh, I remember, I will always remember your loved one. He is real to me. He is real to me, and he will always be in my heart. And there are people who have found that helpful, and I'm so glad for that.
Good. Shane, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, because obviously in our work at AAA, we offer free traffic safety programs. We are strong advocates for improving traffic safety. So love to know your thoughts. Do you truly believe that people's driving habits can change, that people can become better drivers?
Well, that's the question in the end, isn't it? What happened, happened. Can we make change? Can people really become better drivers? And you know, I've heard so many tragic stories, and I know the tragic data, and I went through the experience of killing someone. But for whatever reason, I actually do believe, and I respect people who don't necessarily accept this, but just as me as an individual, I do actually believe people can become better drivers. Like when people say to me, like after hearing my story, that they'll drive better, I believe them. I choose to believe them. I choose to hold that faith. I don't know how long they might drive better or try to drive better, but I am one of those people, even with my experiences, who believes that even some better driving is better than nothing. I mean, so much better than nothing. And I do take heart from the fact that just in my lifetime, there has been change around crashes. Right now, I mean, I know you know, Diana, but I feel like we always have to say this, and I mention this a lot, much to people's surprise, not to anyone's surprise at AAA, but a lot of Americans have no idea that about 40,000 people in this country die every year in what I call, and others call, traffic violence. That is over 100 people a day. People have no idea. But in my lifetime, and I'm not that old, that number was almost twice as high. We have brought down the number. It is shockingly, unacceptably, and tragically high. We have brought the number down. And some of that has come from seat belts and child seats, which, and it's hard to believe now, but you know, I'm old enough to remember most people in this country were against mandatory seat belts and child seats. Not even mandatory. They didn't want them, didn't want to use them, but they changed their minds. And they changed their minds a lot because of stories of the truth about crashes. They changed their minds. They actually came to support what we now take for granted, the laws requiring seatbelts and child car seats. They use them now. They actually use them now. I mean, it's amazing what's actually happening in terms of acceptance. And another thing and another thing that really gives me hope, designated drivers. I mean, 40 years ago, if you'd gone out and said, even mention the term designated drivers, much less mention it, you know, in a bar or after a party or whatever, 40 years ago, no one would have had a clue what you or I were talking about. Designated what? What drivers? What, you know, people with a little gold star in there, what are you talking about? And now, totally accepted. Now, of course, it's designated drivers, not universal, but when you think about the degree of acceptance of designated drivers, along with the seatbelts, car seats, and other things we could mention, wow. So I do believe, I know not everyone agrees, but I do believe people can change. I believe drivers can change. One driver, I just say one driver at a time, driving differently, day by day, drive by drive, and not just by driving defensively. Of course, to drive defensively, but actually that's a message that if I were queen of the world, I would change that. I would talk about driving kindly, because I think it's not just a question of driving defensively, you're not going to hurt me. It's a question which I can speak to of driving so you don't hurt anyone else. By driving kindly, you move toward being the kind of person other drivers wave at, not the kind of person other drivers show another finger to. And I have to say, one thing was really shocking to me. First, I was shocked when I learned how many people die in this country in traffic violence. But I also have been really shocked to learn, and I try to share this whenever I can. I know you know it, Diana, but I always think it's worth mentioning. In other countries like the United States, the so-called developed countries, the rate of traffic deaths is much, much lower. It's not like, oh, that's just human nature. That's the way it is, and that's a number we have to accept. In the similar countries, much lower. And I just choose to believe we can do that here. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm gonna try.
No, for those of you viewing that don't know Shane's professional background, I mean, she does have a background in public health and in advocacy. So I think your insights about how attitudes and behaviors can change are very important. And to reiterate the point about designated drivers, we had done some work and some research with your colleagues at Harvard just on, understanding social norming and how that works. And I remember it being explained to us that, all those years ago, when the work was being done to raise the legal drinking age to 21, that the behavioral experts at NHTSA went out to Hollywood and worked with the Screenwriters Guild to get that term designated driver written into movie scripts and film and television scripts to really bring that into our culture and our social norms. And you're right, the teens we work with today, they know what that term means. We're working really hard to get them to apply that designated driver concept to marijuana in this day and age, as well as to alcohol. But I'm so glad that you raised that, Shane. So I do have to ask, because you mentioned COVID. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just one thought about Hollywood. It is interesting what a difference Hollywood made when it decided to really push for designated driving. When they said, we're going to take up this story and we're going to try to make a difference. But one thing I have to say is Hollywood and the TV industry and writers use fatal crashes all the time as plot devices. And Hollywood and TV, I say TV, streaming, social media, they use crashes to get viewers adrenaline going as ways to change a character's life. And I think, okay, but this is not just a Hollywood phenomenon. Fatal crashes are real. They're happening all around us. And I think, yes, yes, TV, yes, movies, yes, streaming, yes, novels, but let's start talking about this in everyday life. And I would love to see this fatal crashes not just be kind of a plot device in a movie or a novel, but something that we do talk about in a much more daily and realistic way.
Absolutely. And nowadays, obviously, we have social media, which is incredibly influential, especially on young drivers, but also a lot of reality television. I mean, I cringe every time I see the Kardashians jump into a car and not put a seatbelt on, and that has an impact as well. So I'm picking on them and I feel bad, but
Hollywood, no. Well, the Kardashians, they can take it. Hollywood, they're very proud of themselves around having pushed for designated driving, but they have a lot to answer for in terms of telling real stories and not just using fatal crashes as some kind of plot device.
Absolutely. So I want to ask Shane, all the great work that you've been doing, how is the pandemic, how has COVID changed your work in this last year?
It is interesting to think about the fact that people in public health called fatal crashes, called traffic violence an epidemic, and sometimes they called it a pandemic for years before COVID appeared on the scene, because crashes affect everybody suddenly and randomly. So obviously it's really been a time for me and for a lot of us, COVID, of deeper thought about, frankly, sudden death, because all of a sudden our society is thinking more about it. So I've said I have a lot of hope, and I do want to end on a positive note. But, and I know you know this, Diana, but I think it can't be said often enough, even though Americans during COVID have been driving way, way, way less. I mean, we all know this, just, by double digits, driving has decreased in our country, but incredibly, and I never would have thought this possible. I mean, I'm a hopeful person. I never would have thought this possible. The actual number of deaths in our country by car in traffic went up last year. Way less driving, the number of deaths went up. More people died on the roads last year, even though we drove way less. And I have to say, that does give me pause. I am a hopeful person, but I have to acknowledge that with those emptier roads, some people did choose to speed and drive reckless. That's the reason given for the higher number of crashes. And more
Absolutely.
people actually died. So I want to acknowledge that reality, but I also, again, being a hopeful person, I do want to hold out the hope. I do talk to people about maybe COVID could shift people's thinking in some good ways. I mean, I don't want to be one of those people who goes, oh, COVID, how's a silver lining? No, no, no. But possibly because of COVID, people will think more about a few things that from my experience, I consider really important to think about as a driver. Number one, I hope that people are realizing, because of COVID, even if they haven't known the crash data, I hope COVID is helping them realize death can happen to anyone, anytime. It is so much closer than we usually think. And if people can feel that out of COVID, maybe some people will drive better. I think another realization possibly out of COVID is that it is way possible to cause another person's death without meaning to. No one, we don't go out into the COVID world to kill somebody, just like we never get in a car to kill somebody. But we know from COVID, and we could have known for a long time from crashes, we can definitely, as ordinary people, cause another person's death in everyday life. COVID is reminding us of that, but car crashes could have told us that for a long time. You can cause another person's death on an ordinary day as an ordinary person without meaning to. So, my basic thing, if nothing else, is to say to drivers, please, please be as careful as you can, because you and anyone really can cause a death, just like me, without ever meaning to do that.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up the fact that we've seen reckless driving, speeding, actually even seatbelt use. We saw more passengers and drivers being ejected from vehicles during the last year, during COVID. So I'm very glad that you brought that up. I think one of the takeaways is that when we are under stress, it shows up in our driving more often than we realize. So I appreciate you reminding everyone of that. And it's not just in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, it was pretty much a national problem.
Well, and, we have this campaign in Massachusetts where we finally, thank you, Massachusetts advocates, some of whom I know.
Working very hard, yes.
We have the campaign, put down your phone. And we even have a campaign for kids to tell their parents, put down your phone. And I, obviously I think that's a good idea, but I also say, put down your stress, put down your impatience. You are in a machine that, take it from me, can kill instantly. Put down your impatience, put down your stress, become the kind of person that someone, who gets waves. Become that person. Enjoy your drive. Put it all down, please.
Yeah, I like when you talk about waves. Here in Rhode Island, where I live, we have a campaign that was actually started up in Newport, Rhode Island by Bike Newport. It started as Newport Waves, it became Rhode Island Waves, but it was just a means of communication with all roadway users, the drivers, waving to the pedestrians, and the cyclists, I see you, and you have to wave back to acknowledge each other. And it's such a simple concept, but it's exactly what you're talking about. And the other thing, Shane, that I just wanted to bring up is, I think we're all so quick to place blame. We see this show up every year. AAA does, the Foundation for Traffic Safety conducts a traffic safety culture index survey. And year after year, we see similar results where, people are kind of do as I say, not as I do. 90% or more saying they disapprove of distracted driving, impaired driving, speeding, but yet those same respondents admit to a lot of those behaviors themselves, like within 30 days of taking this survey. So, overwhelmingly, we feel that, one of the examples is, drivers saying, absolutely, it's not right to use marijuana. But then in our survey, 14% of millennials were admitting that they would use marijuana and within an hour of usage, get out behind the wheel and drive. So
this is why I tell my story, because people think thoughts. They think, and they fill out your index. Here are my thoughts. What I learned from, all my life as a human, as an advocate, what I've learned is, this is just an obligation I have to Guillermo and his family.
yeah.
What I've learned is stories can sometimes have a power that thoughts, which you thought for a long time, oh, I don't want to be a bad driver. Yes, this and that is bad. Story, thinking, oh, Guillermo, thinking about the close call. So many people say, oh, Shane, I could have been you the other day, thus and such happened. People need to fish up my story and fish up their own stories. And I think, I'm not saying that's going to, do the trick, but I think it's another tool in the toolkit, along with all the great work the AAA and other advocates are doing. Let's get the story out there. Let's have drivers start telling their stories more. So when people get behind the wheel, they think, I do not want to hear that thud. I do not want to be that person. I want to see the other people on the road.
Sure. And that speaks to, we're getting some questions in for you, Shane. One of our attendees asked, what policy or infrastructure changes do you think would improve safety for all road users?
Yeah, there's sort of two levels of thinking about infrastructure. One is just to know that there are a lot of great people thinking about a lot of infrastructure changes that could help. I mean, these, I really believe that drivers need to drive differently, that in the end, as we try to hammer away at those 40,000 deaths, I think changing driver behavior is crucial. And, that's what I can help with because I'm not an engineer. But there are a whole list of impeccable engineering recommendations around infrastructure. And then, akin to that, lowering speed limits, lowering the blood alcohol limit, improving car safety technology, getting involved with driverless car design. Yes, there are a host of technical and infrastructure solutions that are out there. What we, of course, need to do, and I mean, I know probably everyone on this webinar knows this, is we have to get ordinary people's support for these. They need to connect, infrastructure and road and traffic engineering. They need to, and car safety technology, rather than being, mocked and attacked in the Boston Globe. These need to be connected to, you don't want to kill somebody and you don't want to have a loved one killed. And I'd like for people to get that reality and then move into support for safety measures. So I say, first, I'd love it if you would drive differently. And second, hey, go check out AAA and go check out the other groups and look at how many good ideas there are that probably are not going to happen unless you go to those sites and do what the group suggests, like write your legislator, write a letter to the editor. But I do think it's tough for a lot of people to kind of hook into infrastructure and engineering and these solutions, right, if their heart hasn't shifted in some way. They haven't gotten the reality of death by car.
I have enormous respect. There was actually a local mayor who got on his bike and started commuting to work every day on a bicycle, because he was hearing more, more feedback from the cycling community about infrastructure changes, and he couldn't really understand it and wrap his head around those investments until he experienced it. So I think a lot of it is, seeing the road from the shoes or through the eyes of another type of roadway user.
Yes.
One
Let
of
me
our
lift that
safety
up because
advocates.
totally. And I want to lift up, along with the traffic safety groups, along with the engineers, along with the organizations of loved ones, I want to lift up cyclists. And I know a lot of cyclists say, oh, Shane, really, you hit and killed a young man on a bicycle. And I'm sensitive to that. And I just want to say to cyclists, they are doing incredible, great work to call attention to the vulnerability we humans have to cars and trucks. And I bless them, especially as someone who did, in fact, hit a young person on a bicycle.
Yeah, and probably the toughest question that you have that I've seen come up, toughest question of all, Shane. What do you think is the most important thing we can do in communicating with drivers to get them to change their dangerous behaviors? $1 million question.
I'm going to say, from my point of view, in a word, and this is not just a word to me, this is a way of life, as you probably gathered, story sharing. Talk about the vulnerability that bicyclists feel, what it is like to have a loved one seriously injured or killed, and this story, what it's like to be a first responder and see what it's like to be a witness, and finally this piece that I'm trying to bring to light, what it's like to kill somebody. I think that story sharing, that shift, and we've seen that for both good or ill in the politics of our society in recent years, but story sharing has a lot of power. It's not everything. It needs to be harnessed to those safety measures. But from where I sit, I think if we don't just grab people with these real stories, it can be very tough to accomplish the rest of our agenda.
Absolutely. And you have a lot of feedback here that I will share with you. One is about a public service message that we call the ripple effect, that demonstrates the impacts on the other side of these tragedies. So a lot of respect and praise for you in speaking out and understanding that it does need to be coupled with more education around the infrastructure changes. And you're not shy, but speaking up about the visibility being a factor here. So thank you so much. And Shane, finally, I just want to point out that thanks to technology, and you're absolutely right, it takes us a while to wrap our minds around that, but there's more data than ever to show us as drivers where crashes occur. And it speaks to where maybe some dangerous roadway engineering exists right in our own areas, in our own communities where we drive every day. A lot of the states now, especially up here in the Northeast, have dashboards available to the public where they show these crash spots as hot spots. So, I encourage everyone on the webinar, take a look at your DOT website, reach out to us at AAA if you have any questions, if you're having a hard time accessing that data, but it is very interesting to look at. And Shane, we want to thank you. I mean, the irony here is that what you wrote, your phrase, "Don't be me," is what caught my attention about your experience. But in learning more about you and, beyond just this life-altering incident, just the work that you've done throughout your career and the depth and breadth of, the work in public health and advocating for equity, your work with older adults, we realized that we need more people like you, Shane. And crashes, like you said, these tragedies can happen to anyone, to the very best people, to people that had that natural instinct to serve others. And, we need more. You're absolutely right. We need more compassion. We need more compassion behind the wheel. We need more people passionate about their work, and even into the causes that they never expected that they would end up being passionate about in this life, and those committed to protecting others, both physically and emotionally. And you've done a lot of work around that too. So thank you so much for taking the time with us today, and really for your courage in speaking out about this experience.
Well, you know, in a world where there is so much that we can't control, I just say, when you get behind the wheel, don't do anything to increase the chances you might end up being me, end up bringing death. So thank you for the chance to
Thank
talk. I
you.
really appreciate it.
And one of my coworkers, who's a retired police officer, and I'm sure he related especially to, your comments around crash reconstruction and everything first responders see, his final words were just drive kind. And that just about summarizes it. Yeah.
Drop defensive. Let's make it kind. Let's make it about everybody down the chain, down the generations, the families affected by this.
Yep. Love your fellow driver, love your fellow cyclist, love your fellow pedestrian. So thank you so much, Shane. We will be in touch, and I'll share those comments with you right after this.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.